kind of situated at a really unique time in our society. We're kind of moving our industrial economy to a new one. And we've seen in the industrial society how there's been winners and losers. And the question really, will that trend continue? And what can we do about that as a society? And what role do grassroots organizations play in that? And how, as funders, can we support kind of the whole ecology?
For the first time, evidence, actual documentation that people of color, communities of color, were overwhelmingly living in areas of toxic waste sites and toxic waste contamination. Now, ironically, that documentation, if you can believe it, we've had all the environmental conservation preservation movements of the early part of the century. We've had, civil rights movement. We've had the era of environmental legislation in the 1960s and 70s, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all kinds of things were going on. And it's not until really the 1980s when there's actual beginning of documentation that, even though we've had all this legislation and policy going on, we still have some inequities that are going on with respect to the application of these policies and regulations, and what is that all about? Living next to, the oil refineries, living next to the toxic waste sites, having the asthma issues, having the health issues, having the land appropriated, having the timber companies come, having Cancer Alley, massive numbers of refinery plants in their neighborhoods. This was something that was known to communities of color. And so the environmental justice movement really, then what you saw was this bridging between sort of this policy network and academic research network with community activists that were starting to merge together and say, okay, there's something that has to be done around this. And so there have been some things done since the 1980s. I mean, there's, at the federal government, there was an executive order that was established around environmental justice. I won't go into all these details, but just, just these highlights that ended up happening. All right, so here we are, a century after basically the conservation and preservation movements are in place, after all these other major social movements and policy eras were put in place, and here we are at the turn of the century, enter the 21st century, and what we're finding is the exact same issues. National environmental organizations, international environmental organizations, and local environmental organizations have built up an incredible amount of capacity to deal with environmental issues. And yet, what we're still seeing is, even within that environmental justice issues continue, organizations, communities continue to be one of the least funded areas that we have currently. Is obviously there's a massive public investment intentionally geared towards shifting the old way we were doing business. That's good, because the old way we were doing business was environmentally destructive and socially inequitable. We now know that. The question is how we shift and who is at the table and how we create the capacity for groups that didn't have access to that previous economic development process. How is it that they are now coming in to be able to access and have a say and directly impact the new transitions that are going on? Is the investment into that transition of the energy infrastructure is going to places in communities that already have the capacity to do a quick turnaround. Where is the North Minneapolis? Where is the Phillips neighborhood? Where are those communities that don't necessarily have the capacity to engage at this time? And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that those kinds of gaps and disconnects are still continuing. And when we're looking at this level of massive, massive public investment, what we would like to see is how is it that we can come to better understand that flow of dollars and that capacity so that this new clean economy actually geared towards closing the inequity